Some of you probably remember this case right here. This is the Thorzone Mjolnir that's currently on Kickstarter, but for those who don't, in summary, this is a 10-litre small form factor case that can accommodate a 120mm liquid cooler and a full-length graphics card. There are some really cool features about this case, but also a lot of issues with the current prototype that I have here. If you missed the initial testing and review, I'll leave a link to that down below in the comments. In this video, however, I want to focus the discussion on GPU cooling, because the chances are if you're spending this much money on a case, $300 by the way, you're likely pairing it with at least a 2070 Super or higher, more likely a 2080 Super or 2080 Ti. The testing in this video took a really weird turn, and it ended up taking a lot longer than I initially thought, because the thermal and airflow design of this case, especially when you're using a 120mm liquid cooler on a GPU, ends up becoming really strange. Now, I'll first start off by saying that the feedback and criticism that I've been absolutely throwing at the Thorzone team seems to have been handled pretty well so far. I'm not going to repeat all of the issues that I have with this very early prototype model that I have here, because I already discussed that in the initial video, but it is reassuring to see that they've already modeled out and rendered fixes and improvements. Now let's take a look at the tempered glass side panel, seeing as this is something that a lot of Kickstarter backers seem to be opting for, but this is another area that needs quite a bit of improvement. It is hard to critique a prototype because you just don't know what's going to change in the design or manufacturing process for the final production model, but the one that I've got here feels exceptionally DIY. You can basically see the glue on the interior, and even after I installed them, one panel actually detached from the metal and fell inside the case. So these definitely need a pretty significant redesign, and from what I've seen from Thorzone so far, I'm confident that's what we'll get. So no thermal testing on these today, but as you could guess, they are going to pretty much choke the airflow of your components. I don't really recommend them. I know a lot of you have the desire to see all of your expensive hardware on the interior through those tempered glass panels, but keep in mind that the thermal and acoustic cost of doing this is pretty significant. Alright, so let's get started on this next build, and seeing as we're going with the hybrid modded GPU this time around, that means that we're going to be air cooling the CPU. So originally I wanted to go for the Alpenphone Black Ridge cooler, seeing as this is the strongest 47mm tall cooler that I've tested, but unfortunately it doesn't fit on the Asus Z390i Strix. To make it fit, you'll need to remove one of the large VRM heatsinks, that's also the I/O shroud, and I definitely do not recommend running your motherboard without VRM heatsinks. So instead I opted for the CryoRig C7G and then swapped the fan to Noctua's slim 92mm Chromax fan, which runs much quieter. This cooling setup will be more than enough for an i5 or Ryzen 5 CPU, or perhaps an i7 or Ryzen 7 CPU if you're prepared to manage the voltages. For the GPU, we're going with the same card that we used for all of the initial testing so that we can compare accurate data, and that's EVGA's GTX 1080 Ti. The great thing about this card is that we can also take a look at the VRM and memory temperatures thanks to the many onboard sensors. The hybrid cooling kit that I'm using is the NZXT Kraken G12. Overall, just a really simple bracket with a 92mm fan. Cooler is not included, but we are going with the same Corsair H55 that we used in the initial build. Now, as we are going through this GPU teardown, which most of you have probably seen before, I just want to make it clear why we're testing this build in the first place. In summary, there's a big difference between a case being able to physically support certain hardware like a 2-slot 2080 Ti and sufficiently cool it. Just because you can install a powerful card in this case or a similar one doesn't necessarily mean that you should. This is the primary reason that my personal rig in the Ghost S1 is completely liquid cooled. A lot of you know that I'm insanely interested in small form factor PC cases, but I'm also really interested in cooling and reducing noise levels. Now back to the build. It's definitely not the prettiest looking liquid cooled GPU setup that I've ever seen, mostly due to the tubing being so awkward to route. In fact, this was way harder than our initial build where we used the same liquid liquid cooler on the CPU, and that was a lot more user-friendly to set up. But so long as the side panels do close, some of you might not care, because the interior of your build won't be insanely visible. Taking a look at the thermals here, we have the hybrid cooled 1080 Ti in teal, the stock 1080 Ti in orange, and all of the other SFF cases with the stock 1080 Ti in blue. So do not directly compare thermals between the teal and the blue bars here, seeing as the GPU is being cooled differently and in different cases, so we're changing two variables, but I have left them here for some context and perspective. The first comparison that we'll make is just the straight thermal difference between air cooling and liquid cooling the GPU in this case, and we can see here that it's an 11 degrees C drop compared to our previous air-cooled result in this case. This was with the hybrid cooler running at just 1400 RPM for both the radiator fan and the VRM fan. Now, when we compare thermals with the case shell on versus off, there's a 7-degree difference here, which is honestly quite a lot. This is due to the heat not being effectively exhausted from the case. And this is where I discovered something really quite concerning with this thermal design. By positioning the radiator underneath the power supply and having the fan pulling hot air from the radiator towards the power supply, the result is that the power supply ends up taking that air in and actually getting very warm and very loud. This is the first time that I've ever seen this happen in any case, but it's also the first time I've run a hybrid cooled GPU in a sandwich layout case like we have here. What's worse is that when the power supply attempts to exhaust this heat, it only has effectively around an inch of room to exhaust that heat down onto the desk. So when we run a heavy GPU load like a game or a benchmark, it's okay in the beginning, but once the GPU and radiator start heating up and dumping heat towards the power supply, it eventually heats up and gets quite loud. The reason we don't see this happen when liquid cooling the CPU is that firstly, the power supply isn't under anywhere near as much load as in something like a CPU render, and secondly, the CPU isn't saturating the radiator anywhere near as much. There is one way that you can improve this airflow and thermal design though, and that's by flipping the power supply and bracket and also switching the radiator fan as pushing air onto the radiator. Currently, to flip the bracket, this involves 10 screws, so it is quite a bit of a lengthy process unless you have a really long Allen key, in which case it's just 2 screws. So in doing this, here's a look at the massive change in noise levels. And in terms of the thermal difference between the power supply and radiator fan being flipped compared to initially, we see a 5-degree difference in favor of how we had it previously, but the significantly reduced noise levels after the bracket flip definitely have my personal vote. And a quick look at the VRM and memory thermals here with our hybrid modded GPU. The VRM sensors are definitely on the warmer end with this setup, so if you're planning on doing this, I definitely recommend a hybrid kit with VRM heatsinks included, or you could install your own. One drawback of this flipped power supply bracket approach though is that you'll now need to route your cables from the top of the case, and due to the nature of how the case closes, this makes it pretty difficult. In fact, just in general, the more hardware that you pack into this case, the harder it is to get that outer shell on. The tolerances here are very slim, and this might encourage users to go for a more modest configuration in this case. I've talked about the ballooning of the inner core and the expansion of it in the initial video, so hopefully they fix this for the final production model. So in terms of hybrid GPU cooling in this case with the 120mm liquid cooler, it is something that I can recommend. However, only do it if you are prepared to also flip the power supply and face it upwards. Otherwise, it really is just not worth it because the power supply just takes in so much heat and it just gets so loud. If I was to build a personal rig in this case with a 2070 Super or higher, I'd definitely liquid cool the GPU. And so that brings me to my final thoughts on this case, and I want to answer one question that I always get when I'm reviewing any small form factor case, and that's whether I'm going to sort of be moving my own personal system into this case. And for the Thorzone Mjolnir, that answer is no. And that's because my current system inside the Ghost S1 for 240Hz gaming and 6K video editing uses a 2080 Ti and an overclocked 9900KS, and those components can just not be adequately cooled in this case at the same time. This is also the same reason why I'm not using the DNA4 SFX or the stock Ghost S1 without the add-on top hats. There's just not enough radiator space or cooling potential for that really high TDP hardware. So with Thorzone's persistence for improvements and solutions, I can see the Mjolnir ending up as a very refined small form factor case for those who have the cash for it. However, with its primary competition being the Ghost S1, a much more flexible case in terms of configuration and cooling, and also available on Amazon every couple of months, it does have a lot to compete against. The deciding factor for some of you may be performance and cooling, like myself, or it may be more subjective, such as design and aesthetic preference. If you are backing this case on Kickstarter, just be mindful of the thermal performance and noise performance of your potential system and the TDP of your hardware, because it is really important in a small, more closed off case like this. Hopefully the thermal testing that we've done in this video and the initial video has provided some insight into how important that actually is. So that concludes our testing for the Thorzone Mjolnir. If you are interested, you can check it out down below. As always guys, a huge thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.